Good morning to those joining us in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. My name is Ylva Tara. I'm a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Welcome to today's discussion, Debriefing the US elections and their implications for Europe, as part of our transatlantic event series. This monthly series aims to foster meaningful dialogue and shape a forward-looking agenda for the United States and Europe as we chart the path toward 2025 and beyond. Today's conversation takes on added significance, and as we reflect on the outcome of the recent US elections and the priorities of the incoming administration under President-elect Donald Trump. At a critical juncture for transatlantic relations, the new administration's approach to Europe will have profound implications for shared global challenges, including Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, escalating tensions in the Middle East, and China's growing geopolitical and geoeconomic influence. We are here to explore these pressing questions. How should Europe prepare for this transition? What insights can we glean from the early nominations for key national security roles? Where might Europe and the United States find opportunities to strengthen their partnership, and where could potential disagreements arise? And to help me unpack these vital issues, I'm delighted to welcome an outstanding panel of experts and friends. Welcome Kaush Aha, non-resident senior fellow, Global China Hub, Atlantic Council. Ian Brzezinski, Senior Fellow at Europe Center Atlantic Council, Dr. Fran Burwell, Distinguished Fellow, Europe Center Atlantic Council, and Senior Director, McClarty Associate. Welcome Rachel Rizzo, non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. I will have the pleasure to moderate today's panel. After our discussion, just a few housekeeping notes. We will reserve 15 minutes at the end for your questions, so please feel free to contribute to this important conversation. You can submit your question at askac.org and make sure to follow us on Twitter at AC Europe. Thank you again for joining us. It's time to begin. Fran, I'll start with you. How do you see Trump's victory affecting power dynamics at the EU level?
Well, I think that unfortunately for Europe, the election comes just at a moment when a number of the European leaders are very weak. We had almost a day or two after the election, Chancellor Scholz called an election in Germany after months of a very fractious and weak coalition, and he's now a lame duck until the election in February. Macron has been very weak since his party lost the election for the Assemblée earlier this year. And even Ursula von der Leyen, who has seemed strong since her reappointment as European Commissioner, currently is awaiting the approval of the European Parliament for her commission. And that has been delayed by a squabble in Parliament over whether the Italian commissioner should be an executive vice president or a commissioner. And we won't hear until perhaps later today, later this week. So just when Europe should be strong, we have these issues. And I think Trump's election in this situation is going to boost some of those whom we haven't seen as so strong. And primarily, I would point to Meloni in Italy, and also perhaps Donald Tusk in Poland. Never a great friend of Donald Trump. And some of Poland's stature will depend upon how the presidential election there goes later this year. But I think that Meloni, given her close relationship as well with Elon Musk, is someone to keep an eye on. The trick for Europe will be not to let Viktor Orban become the Trump whisperer. And I think there is one other possibility, a shift in dynamics, and that is if Friedrich Merz becomes the chancellor following the German election. He may be a more Trump amenable character than some of the other European leaders, and bears watching. But let me just say that the EU is always fractious. There's always an election somewhere. And what Europe needs to do, three things I would just say very briefly. to grow its economy. The competitiveness debate agenda is very important. Trump will not respect a sinking economy, a weak economy. The second is to be united. If Meloni becomes the Trump whisperer, she needs to represent not just Italy, but also the EU. And finally, Europe needs to stress its own interests and capabilities. It doesn't really work for Europeans to come over here in a Trump administration and say, we can't do X, Y, or Z without you. Trump doesn't see that as a winning strategy, and he likes winners, not losers. So I think Europe needs to be very conscious of what it's saying and how it's viewed over here.
Fran, if Meloni does indeed become the Trump's whisperer, where does that let Germany and France, this power shifting within the EU?
Not in a great place. And frankly, as someone who's been watching Europe for a long time, there always has been this stress on the Franco-German engine driving Europe. And there's a lot of truth in that. But it's also true that Central Europe, for example, has become much more of a player over the years. But they're often fractious themselves. They don't present a united front, so to speak, and even on the issue of Ukraine. But I do think that we're going to see within Europe a more multidimensional leadership, if I can put it that way, rather than it just being France and Germany.
Thank you, Fran, and we'll continue to discuss more about this. But I want to bring in Kaush now that we are having a almost full picture of how Trump administration will look like. What do you think? What do Trump's nominations especially for national security positions, say about Europe's place in the incoming administration foreign policy outlook?
Well, good morning. Thanks. Thanks for the question. I'll make 4 broad points, and then I think you can come back and have related to cabinet nominations as well. One, I think Europe need to really realize that Trump victory was a resounding wide mandate. It's an unexpected and a remarkably strong democratic results of a fair election. So I think not only winning the popular vote, but electoral vote, getting all 3 branches of government, at least the 2 congressional and executive. So I think that's a pretty resounding mandate. So I think that's important. So we ought to quit this nonsense about electoral college and all the rest. So that on the back. Then I think the 4 important point is that the issues that were laid out after World War II by either Marshall or Dulles or Truman of the need for a strong Europe as a good partner for America holds true even today, exactly the same way. So I think a strong Europe is good for America, a weak Europe is not so good for America. That holds today. Having said that, Europe is not that strong, irrespective of the Trump administration, something that Fran alluded to, but she alluded to the political side. I think economically, it's not in a good place. Demographically, it's not in a good place. Economic resilience is not in a good place. And of course, politically, it's not in a good place. So Europe needs a reckoning of its own, I think, and it's as opposed to blaming Trump. It is actually the more polite administrations of democratic ones have sort of clouded over, wiped over a lot of these structural problems in Europe, largely playing nice. So I think the playing nice part of it and calling Europe out to get its act together, I think is much long overdue, and you'll find it in buckets. So the tone would certainly be undiplomatic, saying you need to get your act together on several fronts. But the intent is the same. A strong Europe is good for America. A weak Europe is not good for America. Europe needs to get strong. I think that's element 2. Now, 3 is that there is a very strong positive agenda to be had. There's a positive agenda to be had on China. I think the thing that brought was the so-called this vaunted transatlantic alliance. The foundation of it was a shared adversary, which was Soviet Union and then Russia, NATO, and everything else sort of fed out of it. Now we have a shared adversary, which is China. Now Europe, to say it's ambivalent would be an understatement. also that Europe has come a long way from where we started to where we are at, I think that's a very valid point. It has a long way to go. So I think the future of us in our positive agenda depends a lot if we see shared adversaries the same as we did last 70 years. If we don't, then the people who say, hey, we ought to focus on Indo-Pacific, they have a stronger voice. If Europe can come and say an argument that is no longer just Indo-Pacific or Europe, we've got a China, Russia, Iran, North Korea nexus, and we are to deal with it together, then I think there's a very strong positive agenda to be had on sectoral agreements, on defense production, on infrastructure connectivity, on digital technology, advanced technology. There's a very strong agenda to be had. So I think that's an important part. And I think it's a very healthy thing for Europe. That over-reliance on this, as Fran mentioned, this Berlin-Paris nexus. It has been strong, but it has been kept Europe down and back a lot. It looks backward as opposed to forward. The forward-looking Europeans, which I think, Maloney, I don't say that it's a smaller issue. It is today the most politically stable, most popular, third largest economy in Europe. That's a really big deal. And so I think she is very level-headed and common sense. And I think if Europe didn't get Rafael Fito in, that fractures this whole thing, the whole deal. And again, that's from Baltic to Romania, you've got a strong European partners. And the fourth point I would make, you hear that from Europeans a lot. Europe, in dealing with Trump, first of all, has got to put substance over style. But more importantly, Brexit is the wrong model. Okay, it's very important for Europeans to hear. You don't like it? I'm going to take my ball and go off on a third rail between us and China and India. Well, you can look at what happened to Britain. So if Brexit is the wrong model for Europeans to be under an illusion of. So we got to work together. We have, I think, as Walter said, Walter Russell Mead in his Wall Street editorial yesterday, I think he's right that Trump is exactly what Europe needs to get its act together and reset and reaffirm a forward-looking transatlantic alliance, not a backward-looking, hey, we were together back then, let's stick together. What are you going to do for me? What can we do for each other going forward? I think, having said that, I think we're in a pretty good shape and a very exciting times. Thank you.
Thank you for your optimism too, but I'm going to bring in now our Germany expert, Rachel. How do you see the bilateral relationship that the new administration will have with key partners like Germany or France, especially if Italy's Meloni becomes Trump's whisperer?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question because we're not 100% sure quite yet the approach that Donald Trump is going to take to Europe, toward Europe. But we do have a blueprint from his last time in office. We know that he thinks that the European Union was created to economically undermine the United States, and we know that he looks at NATO as sort of a suck on US resources and views these rich European allies as free riders. Of course, this is not the first time a US president has made these complaints about Europeans. This goes all the way back to the Eisenhower era. It actually deepened during the Obama era. So the question is he going to take somewhat of a mercurial approach toward Europe over the next 4 years? Will it be harsher than it was during his first time in office? Will it be kind of a mix of both? And I think because over the last few years, Trump has actually been able to widen his tent of support, meaning that more people are willing to go work in his administration, good people, smart people who understand foreign policies ins and outs because they've worked in this space for a long time. I think he'll be able to take a much more targeted approach, and we'll see these bilateral relationships between the US and European countries, I think, become the foundation of the US-European partnership rather than this broad view of the US as the foundational ally of NATO. And And that's where these bilateral relationships with key allies become really important. I think we'll have to see what happens in France over the next couple of years with the rise of Marine Le Pen, the weakening of Emmanuel Macron. I do think that the Meloni-Trump relationship will be more important than the Orban-Trump relationship. And the reason I say that is because she has more pull within the European Union. She has more pull within NATO, whereas I think Viktor Orban, and she also shares a worldview with Trump. And so Viktor Orban does as well, but he isn't seen as, I think, having as much pull in those multilateral institutions as Meloni does. Germany is a really interesting point because we remember how harsh the rhetoric was toward Germany during Trump's first 4 years in office. And I think part of that was obviously because he had a contentious relationship with Angela Merkel, but it was also because Germany has not reached its 2% spending goals ever. And that just started over the last couple of years with this $100 billion special fund that Olaf Scholz announced at his Zeitenwende speech at the beginning of 2022. And so that's brought the Germans above their 2% spending target, but sort of artificially so, because they haven't been able to update the base budget to reflect that. So that means that Trump coming in, I think Germany is in a good place, but politically, they're sort of in a rocky spot right now. They're having a vote of confidence in December. Olaf Scholz called that likely. The parliament will be disbanded by President Steinmeier, and they'll have new elections in February. And likely the new chancellor will be CDU Friedrich Merz. And so I think we'll have to wait and see how that relationship builds with Trump. But I think one of the key aspects of this German-US relationship will be, can they perhaps pass another special fund to keep that defense spending over 2% and potentially even closer to 3%? Because let's be honest, that's what Trump is going to want from its European allies. And then can Germany do a better job of sort of extricating itself from the intertwined nature of its economy with China's economy? Because we also know that one of Donald Trump's main focuses will be this global economic and sort of military confrontation, hopefully not a military confrontation in real life, but this confrontation between these two great powers, the United States and China. So let's see how that plays out.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel. I'll come back to you to discuss also NATO again and Ukraine, but I want to bring us now opportunity to talk to Ian. Ian, I think while Europe and the EU are certainly, or at least they appear to look more prepared for a second Trump administration rather than they were in 2016, especially on the trade side, which we will get into it in a minute, less is clear on what the future holds for the future of Euro-Atlantic security. In your view, what will be Trump's 100-day agenda when it comes to the Euro-Atlantic relationship, especially on security and defense?
Well, thanks, Ilva. Can you hear me? You got sound? Great.
Perfect.
Let me just make one quick point. I mean, I thought the points that were made by everyone were spot on. The one where I slightly disagree is the breadth of the Trump mandate. I mean, yes, he clearly won. There's no ambiguity about that, but he got less than 50% of the vote. I mean, the latest figures have him at 49.9% and popular vote, and 48% for 48.2% for Vice President Harris. And even in the Electoral College, it's not that dramatic of a victory. It's 312 votes. In the Senate, you know, he didn't have a huge coattail. He's got 3 votes advantage in the Senate, and in the House, it's probably going to be around 10 seats. So he won. There's no doubt about that, but I'm not sure really, quote unquote, screams wide mandate. This was not Ronald Reagan winning against Jimmy Carter in 1980. So that's something to watch, because we'll see how that plays out in the near term, and particularly in the midterm as we approach the midterm elections. Regarding what Trump is likely to do in his first 100 days, my kind of 6-point agenda that I kind of divine from the statements include the following. First, immediate action on tariffs. Even after he emphasized this during the campaign, he ramped up his emphasis towards the end of the campaign, and he's continuing to emphasize that during the transition. So, we're talking 10% across the board. I bet you when it comes to Europe, you have a particular eye on Germany. That pet peeve from the previous administration seems to kind of haunt him. And in China, I've heard figures up to 60%. And China's sanctions, of course, could have reverberations for the transatlantic relationship. And Matt, even though this is not Europe, think about what he'll do regarding the Middle East. He'll swing hard behind Netanyahu, give him more leash to execute his military operations in Gaza, in Lebanon, and perhaps beyond. He probably will back away from the two-state solution. All of this will reverberate in Europe. Increased pressure on Tehran. They seem to be lining up for new sanctions on Tehran. That's not in sync with Europe's approach to Tehran. Immediate withdrawal from climate change is something that everyone is anticipating. On NATO, I'm not among those who think he's going to come in and trash the alliance. He spent the last 4 years talking about how his previous term strengthened the alliance and increased defense spending. But he's going to come in and he's going to ask for more. We were already anticipating the current administration, if Harris had gotten reelected, to come in at 2.5 to raise, quote unquote, the floor. I bet you he comes at 3 to 4%. And it's probably the right thing to do in light of the challenges the transatlantic community faces, not just in Europe, but in the Middle East, Indo-Pacific, and elsewhere. Where there will be an impact on NATO will be what he does on Ukraine. And I fear that right now he's kind of posturing himself to possibly impose an unjust peace on Ukraine. That's not for certain, but if that's the case, that will have reverberations, profound reverberations and consequences for the credibility of the United States and the credibility of NATO. So to follow my colleagues on what should Europe be doing about this, I very much like the theme of look for a positive agenda. Position Europe as a strong Europe. He's not interested. President Trump is not interested in weak partners. He wants robust partners. That garners more respect and indeed eagerness to partner with him. I think if you want to capture Trump's attention, you got to focus on the issue that's probably the highest on his agenda, and that is avoiding a major war that will drag in U.S. troops. And I think he's probably going to hear from this administration, it's probably a position that's shared by the Europeans, that the biggest national security challenge he has is preventing these 3 regional, now integrated crises, wars in Ukraine, high-intensity war there, in the Middle East, spreading violence there, Indo-Pacific, increasingly assertive China there, to prevent that from escalating to something truly, truly catastrophic that would draw on U.S. forces. For me, that's getting the right solution on Ukraine. That's the hook. That big issue is the hook for the Europeans on the national security agenda to drive a positive, constructive, if not collaborative agenda with the new administration.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ian. I don't know if any of the panelists wants to come back to what Ian said about Trump's mandate, the 49%, and how powerful he is going to be, considering that Republicans control House and Senate as well. If you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I'll comment on it. So I do think it's a wide, and I don't think it's helpful. So I disagree with Ian. Ian disagrees with me. We can have that discussion. The point is the relevance of that in the US-EU relation. It isn't. The main point there is having some illusion and the Europeans that they can sort of go around and find other partners other than Trump that is an illusion and dangerous one. He has a wide mandate. He has much wider than anybody expected. To measure this to Reagan, I think that if that's the Reagan is a measurement, I think it's the wrong measurement. I think where we are today in the country, the so-called divided country of ours, which is not as divided as we deemed it to be. This is a darn big mandate, a lot more than anybody expected. So I think that's the relevance to the transatlantic side. We can nitpick whether this was as big or bad. I think that's fine. And Ian and I can do that over a cup of coffee or beer. We don't have to do it here. So I think main point being for the transatlantic relationship. Yeah, over.
Thank you, Kaush. We can do it here too. People like to hear when experts at your level disagree on certain issues. Fran?
I think the Europeans are well aware that they cannot go around Trump and won't try to, although they will as soon as candidates emerge for the next presidential election. They will build bridges with those. But I think one thing that they're very concerned about is that they will be watching what Trump does domestically here in terms of the Justice Department and our Constitution and rule of law. Because they obviously have some, shall we say, bad actors in their own politics, and they are very concerned about anything that would strengthen Viktor Orban or others who are teeter-tottering on the edge of the rule of law in Europe. So they're worried about hard right, not necessarily ECR right, like Maloney, but the hard right, Alternative for Deutschland and others. And they would not like to see Trump's actions inspire those groups or enhance their popularity.
Thank you, Fran. Rachel, I want to bring you again to help us with these new defense initiatives and what Fran mentioned earlier, the unity within the EU on these matters. Do you think there is enough political will at member state levels? How divided is Europe on how far it should hedge against the potential US pivot from NATO or Ukraine?
So this is a really interesting question because I think that there is broad agreement amongst NATO members and amongst members of the European Union that Europe will likely no longer be the main geopolitical orientation of the United States. And that certainly does not mean that the US will be less committed to its NATO obligations. Doesn't mean that the reality in front of us, which is that we're two of each other's largest trading partners, that doesn't lose any of its relevance. But multiple administrations, successive administrations, have made it very clear that their geopolitical orientation is toward the Indo-Pacific. And when you look at where our spending is going, like our naval spending, for example, that's a good indication of where our military priorities lie. Same with some of the economic decisions that Trump and Biden have both made, both toward China and toward some of our global partners. So in that sense, I'll go back to what I said before. I think that there is an understanding amongst Europeans that they need to become more forward-leaning, and that requires political will, and that requires cohesion. And those are things that are both hard to muster and harder to put into practice than they are to just say out loud. But I think looking at the European Union, for example, they've made some great strides over the last couple of years, especially in terms of building up their own defense and security identity. Earlier this year, Ursula von der Leyen announced the European Defense Industrial Strategy, which is meant to build up Europe's defense technological and industrial base. And of course, that doesn't mean that the United States is no longer going to have Europe as a seller's market for our defense primes. But I think what it does is sort of lay the foundation for Europe to build more of this security architecture for itself. I would say also it depends on how the new defense commissioner within the European Union, the first time that the EU has ever had a defense commissioner, whether or not this person is empowered, whether or not the United States sees this person as somewhat of a bridge between the EU, NATO, and the US, and also empowers them from a US standpoint to serve as a bridge, I think, between these organizations. So again, I think the understanding is there, but the political will and the cohesion, I think, are harder to put into practice. And that's what I think Europe still needs to do a better job of creating for itself.
Thanks, Rachel. We have another 15 minutes before we have our viewers asking questions to our distinguished experts. So please use askac.org as a platform to send your question to us. Fran, How real is the threat that we have been all hearing about, the imminent threat of a US and EU trade war? And what tools does EU have at its disposal to react to a potential trade conflict? How should Europeans read Trump's economic plans?
So let me first, I wanted to react to something else that Kaush had said about China, because I think this kind of puts a context on the potential trade war. And that is that there is a positive agenda for the US and the EU, and it kind of circulates around China. The EU has made great strides in de-risking from China, but there's a lot of concern in Europe about how far a Trump administration will go. Will it move from de-risking to decoupling? And if it does move to decoupling, that is a huge threat to the European economy, particularly given that the way the Americans tend to do this doesn't always involve consultation and affects European companies, including major tech companies such as chip machine makers. So I think there needs to be a conversation between the US and the EU and about China and how far we are going. Are we talking about strategic parts of the economy, or are we talking about the total economy? And this feeds into something else that I think will be crucial in determining whether there is a trade war or not. Both the US and the EU are moving and have moved quite significantly towards industrial policy. And we are trying to do the same things, de-risking critical parts of our economy and boosting our technological manufacturing capabilities. Despite the rhetoric in the Biden administration of doing this together with our friends and partners, we have seen both on the US side and on the EU side, regulatory issues and subsidies that very much indicate that we're doing this in parallel, not together. And I think it's crucial in the Trump administration that there at least be a door to open for friendshoring, so that technologies, materials, products from allies can be seen as within a transatlantic de-risked economy. And that's going to be really difficult. If there isn't the atmosphere to do that, then it's going to be much easier to slide into a trade war. On a trade war, I think, yes, Trump will probably say something about tariffs on day one. It may not mean, though, that those tariffs are effective right away. It can take a long time for investigations to happen and for tariffs to be implemented. The president has different authorizations that he can use, from declaring an emergency that allows tariffs to having a year-long investigation into whether something is overly subsidized or a national security issue or something of that sort. The most immediate date that I'm watching is March 31st. You may recall that Trump put tariffs on steel and aluminum from around the world. And when Biden came in, he suspended those. He didn't suspend the tariffs, but he made them quotas for the European Union. The EU had already begun retaliatory tariffs on the Trump administration, tariffs, and they suspended that retaliation. There have been several efforts to negotiate this situation, but they've all failed. And the EU has set March 31st as a deadline for whether it will resume retaliation on the steel and aluminum tariffs. We expect that Trump will probably change the quotas back to tariffs. If that happens, and if the Europeans then retaliate on March 31st, I think we could be on the road to a robust trade war. We have Boeing and Airbus. That was delayed until sometime, I think, in late 2025. So there are several things that could trigger a trade war. There's also a possibility of a deal. You know, von der Leyen has said that she's looking for a deal, perhaps involving more US LNG. We did have such a deal during the prior Trump administration with Jean-Claude Juncker. It wasn't a hard and fast deal where there were numbers involved, but I think that there is a possibility of derailing a trade war through that kind of mechanism. But we'll just have to see. A lot is going to depend upon what happens in the first 3 months.
Ilva, let me
Yes,
comment on the de-risking
Yeah,
part.
China, I wanted to ask you, but you can comment on what Fran
Yeah,
said.
I think first of all, I appreciate Fran saying it's an important context of China. I think that we got better key focus there than other issues. That's one. If you look at there, then we are now in a time, in an era where economic alliances beckon. That is what we should be. We're basically, we are going to end up there. The question is how much muddling we do between now and there to get there. Okay, that's the question. Whether we fight a trade war, don't fight a trade war, do we go there directly or not? But an era of economic alliances beckons because of very simple fundamentals, which are that if I put in the US, EU, Japan, UK economy, that's more than half the global GDP. The gap between that group and China economically is an order of magnitude bigger than the gap between NATO, US military, Chinese, Russian, Iranian, North Korean militaries. So we're fighting on military stuff, and you spend a lot of time on this, whether NATO's going to go to 3%. It's a long time coming. We're going to 3%. Forget 2%, meet it, get over it, go to 3. Europe talks about something that only Europe talks about. They got to get you. This is why this is a wide mandate in US. It's a wide mandate in US because the elites in US are talking the same way as Europeans do. They don't do that in Delhi. They don't do that in Tokyo. They do it in Brussels or in Berlin or Paris, and they used to do it in Washington, D.C. So Europe is an island there working on God knows what. So you have to get really real on security and get real on China and economic alliances. And let's not make issues which are not that big an issue. De-risking, decoupling are not an opposite of each other. We're running into from an unregulated globalization to a more constrained, stratified globalization, which will include sectors where we would have decoupling. So let's not make enemies where none exist. So we will decouple on high technology, semiconductors, and advanced technology. We will de-risk on solar panels, EV vehicles, and other matters. And we will have most probably normal as we go forward on economy and furniture and other things. So we'll get into this more sort of constrained, structured global system, which will have elements of decoupling, elements of de-risking, and then elements of how it used to be. In that, it is very important that economic alliances be there on the decoupling part and the de-risking part. So on that, and that's where what Fran and I would completely agree. There's a lot of, so the question is, and one more important thing, I think a lot of think tank people create more divisions between these two entities than real politicians. If there's one person in Europe who has stayed with America and said what America has said in Israel, in Ukraine, in China, that's Ursula von der Leyen. There's not a single member that's her. She couldn't be more aligned on things, and she also is much better appreciative of this than she's butters up with sort of Kaja Kallas now. So between Ursula, Kaja Kallas, and Meloni, we have folks who see the world this way to some degree. And it is important to have this positive agenda and focus on that rather than who's hedging what, who's very concerned where, who is better saying the word adversaries. Oh my God, the Europeans don't like the word adversaries. They would like systemic rival. People said no to system, whatever the heck that means. Anyway, so I think this is where we are at. And in an era of economic alliances, US and Europe are better off together than anywhere else. And both sides will get there. It'd be best what we can do to get there sooner than later. I think that's the important agenda that we ought to be pursuing. Over.
Fran has a comment.
So I totally agree about the importance of economic alliances, especially in the future. And I think I see the world fracturing in the same way you do, Kaush. But you do not build economic alliances by threatening your potential allies with tariffs. And so I think if Trump will stay quiet on tariffs vis-a-vis Europe, I think the Europeans will probably find a way to extend the deadline on March 31st again. I think they want, and Ursula von der Leyen, I agree with what you said about her. I think she wants to find a constructive path forward. But if the Trump administration takes the first step by announcing new tariffs on Europe, that will be really hard for her to do. She does not make decisions alone in a vacuum in Europe. She has 27 prime ministers and presidents telling her what can be done. Also, I think for those in the United States who put China at the very top of the priority list, I understand that from the American point of view, but one shouldn't forget that in Europe, there is a hot war going on in their neighborhood. And so that tends to absorb a lot of the political energy and perspective. So China is not there, the top of the list. I think Ukraine, Russia, that is the top of the geopolitical list in Europe.
Kaush, do you want to answer to that, or?
No, I mean, I think you're a moderator who likes to kind of go on the edges. We're on the context, the big chunk of it, we're in agreement. I mean, I think the question whether you shoot off with tariffs or not, this is a long war. The smart people, and I think Fran alluded to this, we're in this for generational and decades. We're going to have a very rocky road to get there, and it would require an enormous patience, consideration, understanding on both sides of the domestic political levers that are at play. But we are in a long war. Even if we have a tariff, how do we get off that? And how do we sort of get into it? So this is a long war. There's no reason reacting to one thing, because in the end, it is your national interest. It's really America first, Europe first. Their national interests are aligned. And that's why I'm very bullish that we'll get there. And it is important to make sure that we get there with the least amount of turbulence as opposed to the greatest. But even if we have the greatest amount of turbulence, the objective is still to get there. It's not like, oh my God, that's why I said Brexit is not an option. You can't just say, by the way, Europe, however imperfect and heavy-handed and obtuse and whatever people may call us, Europe is better off with America as a senior partner than France as a senior partner. They can discuss it among themselves. So at the end of the day, I think we get there at the same time. We should work on it. And I think that the second point that mentioned about China and Ukraine, absolutely. So there are two groups, both in Europe and in America, who are seeing the world not as one full group, but two regional issues. And where do I focus? And they're creating these tensions. Like, should I focus on Indo-Pacific and China? Should I focus it on Russia and Ukraine? North Korean troops are fighting as we speak among the us and experts, which focus here and there. More sort of sensational I am on that, and bigger tweets and bigger headlines I get. But North Korean troops are fighting in Kursk at the moment. That should tell us it's really one bloody big theater in which China, Russia nexus is plus Iran and plus North Korea. So if both of us see it as one, then there's a greater sort of opportunity for both of us to hold line in Ukraine and in Taiwan at the same time. You can't possibly have the days of Europe to say, hey, America, you cannot give up on me and NATO, but please do not get me in the middle of you and China. This is about the most ludicrous statement there is. Literally is. And I think you're going to hear from incoming Trump administration saying that is a ludicrous statement. So I think you've got to get to a point where we see the Ukraine context with the lens of Taiwan and we see the Taiwan context with the lens of Ukraine. It's there, and I think not only the politicians, but also a lot of us need to sort of, because otherwise we're literally dividing it, and if we divide it, Europe will lose. We're just going to focus on Indo-Pacific.
Okay, thank you, Kaush. I want to bring in Ian on the Russia-Ukraine issue and the importance that it will get for US-EU relations.
Well, let me start off by just saying, because people talk about the Asia pivot and that sort of thing. Yeah, United States is definitely spending more time in more places around the world and only has so many hours in a day. But when I look back over the last 12 years, I've seen the Obama administration announce an Asia pivot, didn't happen, quite the opposite. Trump announced an Asia pivot, you read his national security strategy, didn't happen. Biden tried, didn't happen. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, yeah, there may be immense economic growth and strategic significance emerging in the Indo-Pacific. But when you look at just trade alone, investment alone, the US-European relationship far outweighs that of the US-Indo-Pacific relationship. I mean, investment in Europe from the United States is like 4 times that of all the Indo-Pacific. The hottest regional channel right now is in Europe. And when you look at Trump, and yes, there are advisors on the Trump team that are calling for a complete Asia Pacific, but at the same time, Trump himself has questioned whether or not the United States should defend Taiwan. He's called for the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Korea and Japan. He's expressed clearly he doesn't want to be engaged in a war. So I'm the way I look at it, I think it's similar to Kaush, is that, and the rest of my colleagues here, is that the ball is really in Europe's court. If it wants to have a robust, dynamic, globally significant relationship with the United States, it needs to do what it needs to do when it comes down to equalizing the trade relationship, making it more equitable across the Atlantic, making sure its economy is strong, and from a national security point of view, get its act together on defense. And when it comes to, so that it can contribute effectively to these global challenges in appropriate ways, politically, diplomatically, economically, and militarily. But of course, that means it has to do what's necessary in its own backyard, which is really step up its support for Ukraine so that war is ended on terms that will really be just, terms that will give us confidence that there'll be enduring stability in Europe, if not peace. Because if we don't have that in Europe, Europe's not going to be able to operate with us with full force elsewhere in the world, and that will diminish Europe's relationship and relevance to the United States. So that's kind of where Ukraine fits in there.
I want to bring in Rachel now, and we are less than 10 minutes away from ending this panel. So Rachel, I have a question that I would like you and later Ian to answer. The common denominator is an anonymous asking this question. The common denominator for all the flashpoints in the world currently is Russia. Assuming that the panelists agree, how best to convince the incoming administration that a Ukraine victory, a Russian defeat, not only brings a just peace to Ukraine, but also aids in diffusing the other hotspots? Rachel.
So, I mean, the first thing I would say, just kind of going back to some of the comments that my fellow colleagues have made, I sort of disagree with the Ukraine and Taiwan comparison. Like, I don't think that, and again, could be wrong here. I just don't think that, China is looking at how the US and Europe are approaching Ukraine and taking lessons from it to apply to Taiwan. And partially that's because I don't think the incoming team really sees it that way. In fact, I think the incoming team sees our continued involvement in Ukraine as a detriment to our ability to project power in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think that our approach to Taiwan would likely be different, although I'm not exactly sure what that might look like. In terms of Russia, NATO is a big question here. I have always been skeptical of Ukraine's NATO membership, always. Even in the last couple of years of Russia's full-scale invasion, I've been skeptical of it. mostly because I'm sympathetic to the argument that Ukraine and NATO potentially could weaken the Article 5 foundation if the United States or Europe refuse to come to its aid if necessary. But more and more, I'm coming around to the view that I don't really see an outcome for Ukraine that solidifies either a long-term ceasefire or a just peace without NATO membership as a part of it. And I think that Europeans and their ability to also commit to this is going to be a really important outcome here, especially for the incoming Trump team. And so I think the difference here, potentially for the person asking this question, is what does a victory for Ukraine look like? A victory for some people looks like pushing Russia out of the Donbas region, potentially at some point pushing Russia out of Crimea. A just peace for other people might be a negotiated ceasefire line without recognizing the land that Russia is currently occupying and potentially agreeing to long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, for what is left of Ukraine. And that's where I think the NATO membership question becomes really important. I think for the Trump administration, the Europeans are going to have to put skin in the game on this. And that probably is going to require European men and women in Ukraine holding or at least solidifying this ceasefire line in the long term. And I don't know what the future of US presence will look like. Maybe there will be, maybe there won't be. But I think the key to even having the Trump administration be open to these discussions is the Europeans really showing that they care about this and that they're willing to commit to it as much as the Ukrainians are. So I'd be interested in Ian's thoughts on this.
Yes,
obviously.
exactly. Ian, how do you think the Trump administration can be persuaded to this Ukrainian victory that is not important just for Ukraine, but for other hotspots in the world too?
Well, I'd start having the Europeans talk to Rachel. I think she's spot on. The way I kind of look at it this way, if I were in Europe's shoes, and I'm building on the same point that Rachel made, which is that Ukrainian membership in Ukraine is an absolute requisite for a minimally acceptable outcome in this conflict. First, you recognize that Trump doesn't want a war. He doesn't want U.S. forces engaged in a war. He's emphasized that over and over again. He is just as adamant about that as Biden is, maybe even more so. So you need to demonstrate to the administration that we are on the cusp of what could be a global catastrophe that will suck in U.S. troops with immense risks. And the first order priority, when you look at those three regional crises, which are interrelated, Indo-Pacific, Middle East, and Ukraine. Ukraine is the first order priority because that knocks down the main driver of this global challenge to the international order and to peace. You put Russia on the defensive. You demonstrate that the alliance, the West, still has a resolve and commitment to actively, proactively defend and protect its values and its interests. And you probably even begin Putin's own demise, although you can't project that. Second, you tell and you warn Trump that, in the beginning administration, he doesn't want to have his Trump version of Biden's Afghanistan. Coming in and accepting a defeat of Ukraine is a real sign of weakness. This is a team that's coming in that talks about national security strategy of peace through strength. Well, if you impose a Chamberlain-like peace upon Ukraine, that's not a roaring start for a peace through strength national security policy. And then, of course, Ukraine, a settlement in Ukraine that's going to bring enduring the maximum prospects of stability, if not peace, into Europe is NATO membership. And Rachel's absolutely right. But just giving Ukraine membership is not enough because Article 5 has to be given credibility. And that's going to require a NATO force presence in Ukraine. And the backbone of that has to be the Europeans. There has to be an American dimension to it, but the bulk have to be the Europeans, particularly the West Europeans, with the United States providing enablers and other elements. But if the Europeans come and say, we're willing to take the weight on this, well, that rings true to a partner that can stand up and do the heavy lifting, a partner that will carry its share of the burden and will bring the U.S. dimension that'll make that Article 5 credible. That could be convincing to Trump. That makes him, a winner in a number of respects in terms of his key themes of a positive outcome, an early victory, so to speak, or early success on his administration, and European burden sharing. So it's time for Europe to really stand up. That's the best way to manage Trump, and that's going to be an absolute requirement to get what we want out of the situation in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Ian. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask Fran about the implications on the EU and the US Trade and Technology Council. Will it continue or be revamped or retired? How might this affect the future cooperation on digital as well as tech issues? And what do you think of the emergence of Elon Musk as a political figure?
Well, so a bunch of questions there. I've always been a big fan of the TTC, as anyone who's watched me on Atlantic Council panels will know. And I think it served a very good role in being a place where US and European leaders could discuss issues and sometimes vent about disagreements in a healthy way. But unfortunately, I think we are likely not to see it recover from a Trump election. I do think, however, that there were key dialogues which persisted during the first Trump administration, and particularly the one on China and the one on energy security. And so I think there is room for dialogues, but we'll have to see. These are driven largely by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce. We'll have to see what they find as the right topics for discussion. I think those two, energy security and China, will continue, but we'll just have to see about the others. Elon Musk brings in a very interesting dynamic to the transatlantic relationship, especially given his close relationship both with Meloni and also with Trump. But we do have as well a complication or indication of future conflicts in that Brendan Carr has now been nominated as the Federal Communications Commission commissioner, head of the Federal Communications Commission. And he has written very strongly in support of free speech on platforms. And I put it in quote marks because our conception of free speech here in the United States differs somewhat from European conceptions of what is allowable on a platform. And Musk is at the center of those differences. Twitter, or X rather, is under investigation by the Europeans for insufficient content moderation and allowing the dissemination of speech that incites ethnic, religious, racial, and other types of hatred that are illegal under European speech laws. So as many of you will know, Germany, it is illegal in Germany to deny the Holocaust. And across Europe, it is illegal to incite racial, ethnic, and other forms of hatred towards groups. US platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever, that are present in Europe are going to face rules about how they are moderating content, how are they responding to criticisms about this? Whereas in the US, under the Trump administration, it is likely that we will see a movement in the other direction, with the companies being pushed, despite their own service agreements or terms of use agreements, to allow more extreme speech for fear of being accused of censoring conservative views. And so this sets the US and Europe up for quite a discussion about how to regulate US companies that are being pushed in one direction in the United States and in another direction in Europe. And I think we're going to be in for some interesting times on the digital space. And Ilva, you know how this sometimes works in terms of media. And so it is going to be, it's going to be an interesting time. We'll just have to see I think one issue is nobody knows how long or whether the Trump-Musk collaboration will continue. And it's quite uncertain what Elon Musk's real role will be. He actually got from the Europeans the least tariff on his EVs manufactured in China. He will end up paying less of a tariff than the German car companies who are in joint ventures with Chinese companies in China. So the EU gives with one hand, but pressures with the other hand. So we'll just have to see how that's going to work out.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frank, Kaush, Ian, Rachel, for quite a conversation that we had today. I think that's all the time we have for today. We covered a lot of ground from the future of Ukraine, China, as well as transatlantic trade and security and defense issues. And it feels like we could keep going, but there is no more time. I want to thank once again our panelists and our audience for joining us today and for your questions. We will plan to host a follow-up public event discussion in the coming months. Please continue to follow the Europe Center as we explore the next chapter of transatlantic relations in 2025 and beyond. Thank you all again. Until next time.